Hello everybody, thank you for coming to this seminar. So I'm Amaud Lanuque, I'm the author of Police versus Syndicat du Crime, Cop versus Triads. I will do a very short presentation of the book. So it took me about 3 years of writing. There are about 40 interviews of people from the industry, the Hong Kong film industry, which took me about 10 years in order to gather all of them. Amongst the people I interviewed, there were Choi Hark, Chan Ka-sung, Chung Kwok Ming, Chan Yat Kin. I'm not going to list all of them, but just to give you a rough idea. When I did this book, I had basically 3 objectives. The French audience don't know much about Hong Kong, the context of Hong Kong. They know a couple of films, they know Bruce Lee, they know the big names, but they don't really know the history, the culture of Hong Kong. So I wanted to put a lot of context. I wanted them to understand how the history, the culture of Hong Kong has influenced the film. That was the first objective. The second objective was to broaden the horizon of the French audience. As I said, they mostly know about the big names, the big John Woo films, these kind of things, but there are a lot of films which have been done in Hong Kong, which have been produced, which are very good quality and which are basically unknown. So I wanted to shed some light on them. That's probably why it's almost 600 pages, because there are a lot of them to cover. And the third objective I wanted to do was to give credit to the people from the Hong Kong film industry. Sometimes a lot of people think that Hong Kong film industry is very commercial. They only think about making quick money, which sometimes they do. But they also, I mean, each time I talk with them, I saw they were very dedicated about their work. They really wanted to do things good. They wanted to put some message. They wanted to make sure that the audience would be entertained. And it's not easy in the Hong Kong environment where you have limited budget, you have limited resources. And I really wanted to, for the audience, the French audience, to understand that. So that was the 3 main objectives of the book, and I think, I hope they have been fulfilled at least. But for this seminar, I didn't want to focus only about the book. I wanted to broaden a bit the subject and to make it more interesting for you. Thanks to Sam's suggestion, we thought about talking about the titles of Hong Kong films in France. We don't necessarily use the Chinese title, not even the official English titles. When we release film in France, we give them some other titles. And as you will see, sometimes they are quite weird.
Yeah, I think I suggested an idea because I was looking, for me, who's always studying Hong Kong films and thinking about Hong Kong films, and when we talk about gangster films, I mean, probably one of the most famous Hong Kong gangster film is 英雄本色. How many of you do you know the English title of 英雄本色? A Better Tomorrow. It has nothing to do with 英雄本色, but it tells us a lot about the film and the filmmaker in Hong Kong too. So I suggested that too. So I want to listen to what you find out about the French titles.
Well, the French title of 英雄本色 is even, I mean, it's really bad. Okay, so basically, 英雄本色, True Color of Heroes, that really talk about the concepts, the value of a hero, what makes a hero, about the loyalty, the love of your family, all these kind of subjects which are quite deep and interesting. The English title is actually interesting because it was chosen by Choi Hark. And that's not often the case. The English titles are usually found by some people from the marketing, not necessarily by the director or the producer. So in this case, it shows A Better Tomorrow after seeing a choir, if I remember correctly, which were singing a song of the same title, and he thought it would be very fitting for the film. I think the title in English is still good because it conveys some of the value of the film, some of the idea of a better hope for the people, for Hong Kong, because that was just after the joint agreement, the joint declaration. So there is some weight in the English title. The French title, though, is Le Syndicat du Crime, which you can translate by the crime syndicate. And it has absolutely none of this value in it. I think they were basically afraid of making it too complicated for the French audience, so they went for the lowest approach possible. So they saw there were gangsters, they saw there was action, so they just put it as it's a story about gangsters, crime syndicate.
Cool. Yeah. Well, because I've always found it very interesting even the title of the genre. For example, gangster film. The English word gangster. There's gang in it, the collective, and then there's also the gangster, the individual. So the relationship between the individual and the collective is always at play in the gangster film genre itself. But in Hong Kong gangster films, it's quite different. In Hong Kong gangster films are called Hak Bong Pin, so the emphasis is on the collective. Hak Bong is the gang. They're basically gang films, they're not gangster films. So the emphasis is on the collective. But the very important subgenre, the hero films, the Ying Hong Pin, the emphasis is on the individual. So that play between the collective and individual is very, very interesting. And to call the A Better Tomorrow the crime syndicate is once again, back to, I guess, the spirit of the Hong Kong gangster genre. We'll put it back to Hak Bong, the gangster, the collective.
Yeah, it may have fit for some other gangster film from Hong Kong, but I don't think it fits for A Better Tomorrow.
Yes.
Maybe for Gu Wai's Eye, I mean, you could argue it would be fitting better, but not for this one.
Yeah.
If we get back to the 70s, in the example I've chosen, there are not necessarily some gangster film because in the 70s in France, basically there were no gangster or cop film from Hong Kong being released. So I've put some of the kung fu films, which were the one being released in the 70s in France. One of them was The Angry Guest. Do you know the title in Chinese? The Chang Che film with Tik Lung and Kung Tai Wai. But
what is the English again?
The Angry Guest.
The Angry Guest.
Yeah. Don't remember?
No, I don't.
Maybe with the picture, but the picture is going to be bad. No. Okay. Well, anyway, that's a movie with directed by Chang Che with Tik Lung and Kung Tai Wai as the main actors, and it talks about the duo being blackmailed by a yakuza gang in order to do some criminal operation in Thailand. So for the French release, they chose to call it "Il faut battre le Chinois pendant qu'il est chaud," which you can translate by "strike the Chinese while it's hot," which makes absolutely no sense. Basically, but it shows one thing. It shows that during that time, Hong Kong films were not taken seriously in France. They were considered low-class, low-quality entertainment, so the French distributors would make fun of it. And sometimes the title would be borderline racist. I have another example, which is, this one is really a pure kung fu film. So the original title is Invincible Iron Palm. So classical martial arts technique from all these kind of films. And they chose it to call it J'irai verser du gnoccman sur tes tripes, which you can translate by I will pour some fish sauce on your tribes.
I don't think we even put fish sauce on our tribe.
Who would do it? I mean, I have no idea. One of the reasons why they choose this kind of very long and very evocative titles may be because that was kind of the trend in the Italian popular cinema back then. A lot of spaghetti western would have this kind of very evocative title, and so I guess they tried to copy this trend because they thought it was probably the same kind of market, the same kind of audience. But still, it's very bad anyway. And another interesting aspect was that basically people didn't know much about Chinese martial arts. They didn't really talk about Kung Fu. So when they were releasing those titles, they usually chose to put karate, because karate was the Japanese martial arts which was known in France. So they would change all the title by putting karate in it. So this one was originally Duel of Fists, so another Kung Tai Wai Dick Lung film, and it became Au Karate Takare Atake, which, well, which you can translate with karate, attack and attack again, but the translation doesn't make justice to just the sound of it. It's French, is already ridiculous. So it's already, you can see that they're already making fun of this kind of film just by the title. This kind of trend of using Hong Kong film in order to parody, to make the audience laugh, was the pinnacle of this approach was reached in 1973 with this film, which is called La dialectique peut-elle casser des briques? Can dialectics break bricks? So this one it's not just the title, which is stupid. They used a very basic kung fu film where you have the bad Japanese and the heroic Chinese fighting them, very classic. But then they completely changed the meaning during the dubbing. So during the dubbing, it's all the people talking about extreme left-wing ideology, and in a very serious way. So they would be talking about communism, Trotskyism, Leninism, materialism, all these kind of things, while at the same time they would be fighting. So this kind of contrast would make it a very weird and funny movie, but obviously not respectful at all from the original material. And the things fortunately evolved a little bit during the 80s. So the French distributor finally realized that they were not dealing with Japanese film or any other places from Asia, but they were actually Chinese film. And when they realized that, they started to put the word Chinese in the title, but all the time. So for example, when they released Choi Kun, Drunken Master, they thought it was a Chinese movie, so it's better to call it The Chinese Master, Le Maître Chinois. And with the case of Sing Lung, they did it even more and more after. So there was another film which was released in 82 or 83, I'm not sure. That's Battle Creek Brawl. That's the movie which was supposed to launch Jackie Chan as a star in the US. And so Battle Creek Brawl is the real title. They just called it The Chinese. So this way you are sure that the hero is Chinese.
Was Jackie Chan the superstar that he is now, or anything close to that during that
You mean
time?
for French audience?
During the release of the Battle Creek Brawl.
No, he was not very famous yet, but he was on the way. Because there is one interesting aspect of Jackie Chan. His brand of humor and action was actually already done by a French actor whose name is Jean-Paul Belmondo. So Jean-Paul Belmondo in the 60s and 70s, he did a lot of films where he was being funny, but he was also doing his own stunts. And,
he also made one in Hong Kong.
Yeah, right. Which was Les Tribulations d'un Chinois en Chine. How do you translate that? Voilà. Thank you, Rémi. And actually, Jackie Chan recognized the influence of Belmondo. Usually, he always talk about Buster Keaton, this kind of silent era American artist, which obviously were an inspiration, but Belmondo was another one.
Yeah, in fact, this is something I actually talked about when I talk about Hong Kong cinema, and I think the influence of Belmondo is actually a neglected influence on Hong Kong cinema. I'm glad you raised it. Yes.
And then there was a second attempt for Sing Lung to break the American market in '84, I think. That was The Protector, which was a movie which, so we are getting back to the cop and gangster film here. That was the Dirty Harry of Jackie Chan. And so I think you can guess what they're going to call it in French. So that was Return of the Chinese. So when it comes to Jackie Chan, it kind of improved with time. Then later on, they would keep the original title more often, but still there is a tendency for the French distributor to dumb it down. So, for example, when they released My Lucky Star, how is it in Chinese? Sing Sing? I can't remember.
My Lucky Star.
Oh, My Lucky Star. Yeah.
Do you remember the Chinese title?
I don't remember.
Well, anyway.
I'm not very good with English titles.
Okay.
Myself.
When they released it in France, it was called the Hong Kong Cop. So it seems like after realizing he was Chinese, the second step was for them to realize, oh, he's actually from Hong Kong. And so they started to put Hong Kong. So there is an improvement at least. That was also and then later on they realized he was a star, so it would become the main subject in the title. So it would be like Indiana Jones on the Last Crusade, Indiana Jones on something. Then it became Jackie Chan in the Bronx. And so the logical conclusion of these two trends came in 1999 with a film called Gorgeous, which was called Jackie Chan in Hong Kong. Which can apply for like half of his film, but anyway, they considered it was the right title. Well, fortunately, things evolved in the mid-'80s. So French critics started to be interested about Hong Kong films and to be really passionate about it and do some real deep insight articles. There was, for example, Les Cahiers du Cinéma, which did a special on Hong Kong in 1984. One of the writers for this special edition was Olivier Assayas, who would later become a director and also the husband of Chang Man-Yuk for a few years. So this good press led to more Hong Kong films being released in France and the titles being a bit more thought of and being improved. So there was the John Woo case. So The Crime Syndicate is not a very good title, but compared to the previous one, it's still an improvement. And then they started to keep the original title. So, for example, The Killer, so the John Woo film with Chow Yun-fat, Lee So-in, Cho Kong, was kept under The Killer in France because there had already been some articles in the press which used The Killer. So people were kind of used to this title, so they thought no need to change it. And this trend continued until the mid-90s. So there was a magazine which was released in France called HK Orient Extrême Cinéma. It was specifically dedicated to Asian films, and a lot of it was spent on Hong Kong film. And it was kind of a luxury magazine, so they did some really well-thought articles about Hong Kong film. They really took them seriously. There were a lot of very long interviews with people from the industry. And at the same time, they were releasing VHS. So they were releasing films in good conditions, because usually in France, when you release film, you dub them in French. So in this case, they kept the original version with subtitles. They respected the format because another bad habit was to cut them. So they really took them seriously, and it kind of changed the perception of the French audience toward Hong Kong film. And that actually started a small trend for Hong Kong film, which lasted until the mid-2000s. And it even influenced French cinema, actually. They started to try to imitate some of the Hong Kong recipe. One specialist in this tendency was Luc Besson. He hired some Hong Kong choreographer, and he even hired Lee Ling-kit at one point, producing 2 films for him. And he tried this formula with different ways, with just French actors, but keeping this kind of Hong Kong way of mixing comedy, action, being very entertaining. That lasted for a few years, but I can't say it really worked on the long term. Then after they moved to some other trends. And so from then on, basically all the Hong Kong film which have been released in France have been under the original English title. So either a direct translation from the English title, either the English title itself. So that shows that at least there is a better appreciation of Hong Kong film in France, which is good. But sometimes that may not be the right move. I will give you 2 examples. One of them is OCTB. So that's a Kirk Wong, Wong Tze-kung, a movie with Lee So-yin and Wong Chao-san. Do you actually know what is OCTB? I mean, what does it stand for? Oh, so you know. But as you can guess, the French audience have no idea. But still, they released it this way. At least they added a little subtitle in order for the people to understand that it means organized crime and triad bureau. But even like this, I'm not sure the French audience really got it.
But I think it's great that so the French people will start to appreciate, to know more about Hong Kong, because now they know about such thing as OCTB. That
yeah, well, but I'm not sure a lot of people bought the VHS of OCTB, to be honest. That was not a very good movie. But still, there was a better appreciation because of all this work done by in magazines, and also you had some books which were released on Hong Kong cinema. So yeah, the appreciation really improved, and the French audience started to take Hong Kong films seriously. But I would still say that it's not a mainstream audience, because most of the film we are talking here were released on video. Not many of them were shown directly in theaters. The few ones they tried, it didn't necessarily work very well. They tried to release Gunman, a Choi Hark production, once again directed by Wong Tze-kung, and it did a big flop. Usually when they release Hong Kong film, it's either Wong Kar-wai style or some Moab pin, a bit like Choi Hark, big epic, this kind of things. That's the only one who can get some kind of limited success. When it comes to Triad and Cop film, they usually are not released in France in theater. They are released only in video. And another example is Infernal Affairs. So Infernal Affairs, the original title is Morgando. So it refers to the Buddhist hell, if I can put it this way. So the English title already tried to keep some meaning like this, but I'm pretty sure that the French audience didn't get the idea. Especially keeping the title in English. Infernal Affair, it doesn't really talk to them. And as a matter of fact, most of the people I know from France, usually they called it Internal Affairs. They didn't get it was infernal, because there was nothing to do with hell or whatever. They just didn't get the reference. So it made more sense for them for the film to be called Internal Affairs. And it was kind of the same for another movie, which is Sa Po Lang. So once again, another reference to Buddhism, which was released under the name SPL, which means nothing. So you see, it's more respectful. So in a way, that shows an improvement. But at the end,
cool.
sometimes it missed the
Satpolo
point.
SPL. It's cool.
But it kind of missed the point, I think. Maybe they can still keep it respectful, but with taking into account the cultural differences. But still, it's better than the way they released it in the US, because they released SPL as Killzone in the US, which is so generic. So that's the overview about the way Hong Kong film have been released in France.
Okay, yeah, I think to me the gangster film, of course, is a very, very important genre. Gangster and cop film, actually, but gangster film in particular, in my view. But I think I wanted to start with a wider perspective on not only Hong Kong film, but Chinese cinema in general. An idea that actually I've been talking in many of my classes and lectures, the idea of what I call grind and bind. In Chinese is mo hap, mo and then hap, or as, it's better to call mo hap grind and combine, but I think it's something that kind of explain what the Chinese people and Hong Kong people, or the Chinese-speaking people, have been going through for much of the past 200 years. When Chinese, when the Chinese people is trying to come to terms with the conflict between Chinese traditions and Western modernity. And of course, to a larger extent, this is mo hap. The grind and bind is a human experience. Human beings are always trying to grind away something and to bind or to combine with something. And I think, for example, in France, France is going through the post-war years of coming to terms with a Western civilization dominated or dictated by America. And so this grind and bind is very much a human experience, but for the Chinese-speaking people, and Hong Kong people included, it is a particularly important issue. I'm fond of talking about, when I talk about Hong Kong cinema, outside of Hong Kong, I talk about the past, what happened to the Hong Kong and Chinese people in the past 122 years. Why do I say 122? Why 122 years? Because film is 122 years old. It started, the film was first projected in Paris in 1895. So the history of film is 122 years old. And this 122 years actually coincided with some of the most eventful and often traumatic period in Chinese history. So the Chinese people actually have experienced a lot of things in the past 122 years, and one way or another, that experience is recorded on film. So looking at Chinese film and Hong Kong films, you can see a very particular animation of Chinese history. And in particular, to me, a gangster film. Gangster film is, to me, I would call it a special way of grind and bind. We're dealing with some specific issues of traditionalism, Chinese tradition, and Western modernization coming to terms with each other, or the Hong Kong people trying to come to terms with finding a balance between Chinese traditions and Western modernity. And for example, in gangster film, I'm wearing my gangster shoes today too, just to dress appropriately for today. I'm fond of, actually, I like wearing these shoes because it's a very good conversation piece. People will always say, oh, nice shoes. And I say, no, it's my tribute to gangster films, because I do like gangster films. Of course, it's a three-level discussion. And then from there, from gangster film, I'll talk about capitalism, because as Francis Ford Coppola famously said about Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola is the director of Godfather, and he said, The Godfather is a metaphor of capitalism in its purest form. So to me, is my comment on capitalism. And then the third level of my wearing these gangster shoes is people ask me, how is it a comment on capitalism? I said, well, capitalism, I cannot do without it, so I wear it and I stomp on it. So anyway, but why do I talk about capitalism in Hong Kong films, in Hong Kong gangster films? Because just like American gangster films, Hong Kong films is a way of Hong Kong people or to a larger extent, Chinese people, because Hong Kong films are shown all over the Chinese diaspora. During its first release, but also later through various ways in mainland China too, even though those films were banned. So Hong Kong film is, and especially Hong Kong gangster film, is a way of dealing with capitalism. To make things simple, I'm not going to go into the detail of Hollywood gangster film, but simply put, American gangster films like Public Enemy, Little Caesar, and Scarface, and Godfather, especially the early gangster films, are about people trying to deal with the free market enterprise. Usually, like James Cagney started Public Enemy wearing a worker's uniform, but in the middle of the film, he's already wearing a tuxedo, which means he has risen in society. But he doesn't rise in society going step by step. He actually jumps steps by killing people. With violence, he was able to reach the top of society from being a very low blue-collar worker. So, in other words, a comment on capitalism. It's very difficult for ordinary people, for the little people, for the common people to reach the top. Like, how many of us can become Lei Ga-sing? Probably none of us, okay? But if you kill, if you use guns, if you're a gangster, you may be. See, that's one of the allure of capitalism. But the interesting thing about Hong Kong gangster films, especially the hero films, the perfect example is A Better Tomorrow, 英雄本色. The beginning of 英雄本色, Chow Yun-fat and T. Long are already successful. How many of you remember the beginning of A Better Tomorrow, 英雄本色? It took place in the Central, Zhongwan. And what kind of car do T. Long and Chow Yun-fat ride in? A Rolls Royce. A Rolls Royce. He has made it already. Unlike James Cagney, unlike Paul Muni in Scarface, Chow Yun-fat and T. Long had made it already. So the skipping of the steps to reach the top of society is not that important for the Hong Kong gangster film. But what is important in the Hong Kong gangster film? If we know about A Better Tomorrow, which kind of defined the Hong Kong gangster film in a very big way, it's about betrayal inside a gang. It's about the betrayal of loyalty. It's the violation of the 忠義, the violation of the 義氣, the spirit of righteousness or the spirit of loyalty that is so important in Chinese popular culture and popular fiction. So, in other words, especially in taking A Better Tomorrow, 英雄本色, as an example, it's a story about people who do not obey the rules inside the gang. Think about that. These are gangsters who do not obey the rules of the land. They are outlaws. They break the law. Like Chow Yun-fat was involved in counterfeiting American dollars in A Better Tomorrow. So he breaks the law in society. But inside the gang, he obeys the law. In other words, the Hong Kong gangster is someone who jump steps in society, but follows every step inside the gang. And the loyalty and the 忠義, the spirit of loyalty, the spirit of righteousness inside the gang is a very traditional Chinese kind of morality. It's a very Confucian like. 非常儒家嘅, a very Confucian-like morality. So very obviously, you can see that the Hong Kong gangster film is dealing with capitalism, which is a very Western and modern notion, but also traditional Chinese morality. Another thing is, of course, the idea of individualism. Individualism is a very important issue of Western culture. But for Chinese people, as we know, Hong Kong is still, I mean, for me, who actually immigrated to America 30 years ago, and I started coming back 20 years ago to work in Hong Kong, I found Hong Kong to be a much more conforming society than America. I have to emphasize that I'm not saying that one is better or the other. You know, whether individualistic or conforming, to me, I found good in both types of cultures. But it still is. I will put my life on the line to say that yes, Hong Kong is a much more conforming society than America, which is to say, the collective is much more important. So to me, to call a gangster film in Hong Kong Hak Bong Pin, the gang film, you can see immediately the importance of the collective. Okay, this is something I can talk on for 3 hours, so I'm not going to do that. Don't worry. But just to make you think about. But then, of course, and then from the gang film, Hak Bong Pin, we developed a subgenre called the Ying Hong Pin, the hero film, the individual. So the whole genre is a play between the individuals and the collective. And I think this is to talk about. Of course, with cop film is very, very interesting. We can see a lot of Western influence. For example, Jackie Chan, Le Chinois, the Chinese, and the Chinese. And I think it's very interesting. The police story is The Chinese Return. So it's the first film that.
That's not Police Story. That's Protector. That's the one he did
Protector.
just before.
Okay.
Just
Yeah,
before.
yeah.
Police Story was actually kept under the name Police Story.
Police Story. Okay,
Yeah.
but with the English.
Yeah, they kept it
that's
English.
You know,
in order to make it more American.
The French title for Police Story is the English title for Police Story, and that's France doing the grind and bind. But anyway, the Police Story, for example, is very, very influenced, of course, by Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, and Belmondo, but also Dirty Harry. I think the way Jackie Chan, the policeman, was trying to deal with the suffocating rules inside the department, which is kind of a Charles Bronson, Dirty Harry type of like. To uphold the law, we need to break the law, kind of a double standard, or the end justify the means kind of morality. So, in other words, all the time, even in gangster film or cop films, Hong Kong, through its cinema, is dealing with this grind and bind, this trying to come to terms with, trying to find a balance between Chinese traditions and Western modernity. So I'll start with that.
Don't you think, Sam, that makes the undercover agent film the quintessential Hong Kong film, because it deals with the question of identity? So, am I really Chinese? Am I really from the West?
Exactly. Am I good? Am I bad? Am I Eastern or am I Western? I mean, this is like, it's the story of my life, being a Chinese American immigrant, and I think for being a Chinese American for Karen also. Yeah, and I think exactly. I think the undercover, on the other hand, is also it's universal also. The kind of self-pitying. It's like I cannot be myself. I have to pretend to be someone else. I mean, poor me. I mean, that's very individualistic. That's very Western. And also in some ways it's even narcissistic. I'm so sophisticated. I'm at once good and bad. I'm at once East and West. So it's a very, very interesting play of a culture, of Hong Kong culture and Chinese culture, and Hong Kong people and Chinese people.
I speak now. So my name is Karen Fang, and thank you to Arnaud and the French Consulate for allowing me to be a surprise guest today. And let me see if I can sort of bring together what we've been talking about. So Arnaud sort of begins with this position of genre specificity, right? And particularly in this wonderful presentation, which is incredibly witty. The ways in which genre makes things both accessible to people outside the culture, but then also sometimes genre doesn't travel well, or it travels differently as it moves across the globe, right? And then as Sam was talking sort of more philosophically about the meanings inherent within the genre, if the gangster genre is about capitalism, what are the particular identity crises that inhere for the sort of capitalist urban modernity, right? That this really commercial formula seems to be about, right? So one of the things that I've been interested in, which you can see in this book that I have that came out this year, it's called Surveillance in Hong Kong Film, and surveillance is a French word, so it's very appropriate that we're here. And one of the things that I try to do in my book is talk not only about crime genres or the gangster genres or the undercover genre, which was we know has a very privileged history or tradition in Hong Kong cinema, but I moved back from that to talk about the sort of motif of surveillance throughout Hong Kong film. So surveillance, like voyeurism, eavesdropping, data collection, peeping toms, just neighborhood intrusions, right? Surveillance, basically social, spatial, and data monitoring, right? It's a term we hear a lot in the world today. I know you in Hong Kong under China deal with this all the time, right? In the West in particular, surveillance is a word that's really given a negative cast, a pejorative, detrimental thing. We see it as repressive. It works against our civil liberties, right? It involves intrusion. It's basically bad, right? And one of the things that I talk about in my book is, first of all, is surveillance, I'm suggesting, offers a really interesting way of thinking about Hong Kong cinema. It's something that happens over and over and over again in Hong Kong film. It's responsible for some of its most distinct genres, like not just crime films in general, obviously the importance of the undercover or covert operations plot within Hong Kong film, but also like other genres, like the gambling genre, which again has a very long tradition in Hong Kong cinema, very specific to Hong Kong cinema, depends upon surveillance, right? People are always watching each other, right, for poker faces, to count the cards. The casino is watching you, right? And one of the things that I argue is that surveillance gives us a way to think about what makes Hong Kong cinema distinct. In terms of its genres, in terms of the stories it tells, it also accounts for this kind of very sort of aggressive visual style that we think of as sort of distinctive to Hong Kong film, that Hong Kong film looks more exciting, is edited differently than your classical Hollywood film, your European art film. And one of the things that I argue about the reason why surveillance is so important in Hong Kong and also so different is, part of it comes from culture, and people will say Hong Kong has this really interesting history of an ethnic Chinese culture growing up, maturing under, tended to for 150 years under a Western colonial government, now under Chinese rule. So there are peculiarities about the culture of surveillance in Hong Kong, incredibly urban, dense environment. Everybody in Hong Kong is used to seeing your neighbors' lives all the time. Right? You go out into the city and you see things that you don't want to see. We're used to all of our lives being inspected in Hong Kong. And so sociologists for many years have argued that the culture of surveillance in Hong Kong is very interesting, very distinct for precisely that reason, and that people are sort of used to it. And at the same time that I agree with that, and that maybe accounts for why Hong Kong cinema looks so different, one of the things that I also want to try to point out in my research is to remind people that surveillance has been a recurring trope in world film from the beginning of the medium. So some of the very first early films by Thomas Edison, by the Lumiere brothers, are very much interested in watching, because that's what it's about, right? Film is about optical devices that allow you to see things that you may not have been able to see before, to see them differently. And so cinema, from the very beginning of the technology and as the art practice, has repeatedly used surveillance in some form as a sort of reflexive motif to think about itself, right? And so some of the most important films in world film history, starting with The Great Train Robbery, right, which is the first crime film in a sense, right? Rear Window, obviously. Does anyone recognize this Hong Kong film on the cover of my book? It's the Hong Kong remake of Rear Window that was made 6 months after the local release of the Hollywood film.
Also called Hao Chang.
Yeah, it's the same. It uses the same title as the Chinese translation of the Chinese title for Rear Window, but the Hong Kong remake is a musical and a situational comedy. So if you know the Hitchcock film, right, this just goes to show you how differently the culture of surveillance in Hong Kong or in Hong Kong cinema is, right? That there's no murder mystery in the Hong Kong movie. So the thing that has to happen in the Hollywood movie to make surveillance okay, right? They just don't even bother with it in the Hong Kong movie. And so so while on the one hand I argue that we can using surveillance allows us to like appreciate what makes Hong Kong cinema so unique and so different. At the same time, I'm also arguing we can learn from Hong Kong cinema because Hong Kong cinema not only teaches us about how to live in a world of increasing surveillance, which is not just something that affects people in Hong Kong, but affects all of us wherever you are in the globe. Right? Privacy laws are different throughout the globe, but they're much stronger, and lucky French people, than they are in the US or in Hong Kong. But we all have to deal with it in our own ways. And also at the same time, surveillance also shows us how ambitious Hong Kong cinema has been historically as an industry and as a national tradition. Because every single time Hong Kong deals with the motif of surveillance, they're not just saying, here I am talking about surveillance, showing what surveillance is like in Hong Kong. They're also saying, look what Hong Kong cinema can do. We can be as good as Hollywood or as good as French cinema because we're just doing it. We're taking that very same subject, but we're treating it differently and doing it in interesting and surprising ways. And so one of the things, so one of the chapters I talk about in my book is actually, we all know in Hong Kong how important the triads are, not just as content or topics within the genres of Hong Kong cinema, but actually within the industry itself. But actually, some of you may know that the Hong Kong police have worked in close collaborations with the local media industry since the 1970s. And so one of the things I talk about is a sort of like, if this is the dark underbelly of Hong Kong culture and the Hong Kong film industry, there's also an incredibly there's an official surveillance presence in Hong Kong cinema as well.
Thank you, Karen. So I guess we can move to the Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please go ahead. Don't be shy.
Hi. So one thing I noticed on display, so Infernal Affair had an American adaptation by Martin Scorsese, Deported, and I would argue that two films, I mean, Deported, it's a very close adaptation to Infernal Affairs, but somehow The Deported, it's a much more well-received film. So what we can see here is that a sort of American director taking the sort of Asian idea and gives it a Western cosmetic and make it more popular, even though the two films are equally individualistic. I mean, other films are all about Boston, this one's about Hong Kong. And so wondering if there somehow the American version of the same story is much closer to the idea of a universal value, even though this one is somehow less so. What do you have to say about that, I wonder?
When it comes to value, I don't think the American adaptation has a more universal message. I think the message from the Hong Kong version is already pretty much universal. What Hollywood has, which Hong Kong doesn't, it's the marketing, the power of marketing. They are so strong that you can never really, so far at least, you cannot really compete with them on this kind of international stage. Having said that, Infernal Affairs was quite successful. I would not say worldwide, but in the West at least. It did have a good release, good quality release. It was released directly on DVD in France, but there were some special extra for the movie being done in France specifically. They really took care of it, and it got some kind of success, local success. But of course, it's always very difficult to go through and get the mainstream audience. As soon as it's an Asian film, you may have some kind of success, but it will be always limited. It won't be the same range as Hollywood. Why is it the case? I'm not sure. I think that's just very basic things. Just you can relate more easily when you see some Hollywood actors, white actors, rather than Asian. The cliche about people in the West not being able to recognize Asian faces, it's stupid, but that's unfortunately still quite prevalent. So that's these kind of things which make it difficult, and that's why when they changed the title, that they try to make it more generic, more American, in order to attract the audience. Because if it's too culturally localized, the French audience won't necessarily be interested.
Well, and also, can I speak to this? So Arnaud was talking about sort of the gradual sort of ennoblement of Hong Kong cinema in sort of the Western market in general that's happened over the past decades. And actually, The Deported is sort of like the pinnacle of that moment, because, you know, Scorsese actually paid property rights in order to adapt the story. So this is like the first time in history, right, that actually happened. Because typically when Hollywood, I mean, in the past, Hollywood never really borrowed that much from Asian cinema.
Reservoir Dogs.
Huh?
Reservoir Dogs.
Yeah, and
With
that
City on
Reservoir
Fire.
Dogs, you know, Quentin Tarantino just steals it, right? And also does the same thing. You know, Tarantino and Reservoir Dogs, Scorsese and Departed, both of them reproduce shot for shot entire sequences, right? And it's not so surprising with Tarantino early in his career. It's remarkable for someone of the stature of Scorsese, right, to choose to reproduce scene for scene, shot for shot entire sequences, right? But the fact that he paid rights to reproduce, he acknowledges the importance of the original Asian property is significant and shows the rising reputation of Hong Kong cinema. And then what's interesting is you can almost think about Scorsese in the film, sort of, you know, by localizing it, by putting in South Boston, he merges it with a distinctly American story. It's based on the Whitey Bulger story, who was an FBI informant, right? So he's essentially trying to whitewash, right, the original Hong Kong story by making it as American as possible. And you can almost see that as a kind of like, it's a kind of like paranoid move, right? To say like, no, it's really my story, right? It's really original, right? And so I think that's indicative of this kind of, you know, rising stature of Hong Kong cinema that Arnaud was talking about.
Yeah, but also I think another reason that The Departed was so much more successful is the American soft power. Yeah, it's like Arnaud has been saying, you know, the marketing, but to me, it's not only the marketing, but the American culture, the way it dominates the world's imagination. I think, and I think it's interesting you mentioned the word universal value, because it's something that we in Hong Kong think about a lot and debate a lot. But I'm fond of pointing out that the idea of universal value comes from the West. How universal is that? I think there's a question.
Yeah, so I have a question asking all of you. For the Hong Kong film, for the comparison between the Hong Kong film and the Western angle viewed Hong Kong, the gangster film, do you think that the Hong Kong local filmmakers would make such a film with describe more on the brotherhood?
I don't quite understand your question. I'm sorry.
Are Hong Kong films more interested in brotherhood than Western?
Yes, in some way, but in a specifically Hong Kong way, because I think, for example, in the West there are also movies about brotherhood too. You know, now, you know, for example, the word bromance, and you know the male bonding or the male friendship, but in Chinese culture and in Hong Kong films in particular, the idea of yi hei, you know, the spirit of loyalty, the idea of zhong yi, loyalty and righteousness, are very much derived from popular, Chinese literature, Chinese popular literature, like The Water Margin or The Three Kingdoms, 三國演義 and 水滸傳. You know, the idea of the male loyalty to each other. And once again, it's the idea of the collective. You know, of course it go back to very complicated history in the sense that for a long time people cannot trust the government, so have to trust themselves, trust the brothers. And for a long time, men feel like they cannot trust women, so they have to trust each other. But of course, so they also die for each other. So it's very the interesting play between in the brotherhood in gangs is that there's also hierarchy. Also, there's not only yi. Righteousness, but also zhong, loyalty. What are you loyal to? Are you loyal to like a 小弟, someone below you, or are you loyal to your 大佬, someone above you? So there is a hierarchy in that kind of altruism also.
And I think it's also visible in the different production styles between the. I'll just go examples between Hollywood and Hong Kong, two very advanced, prolific film industries. So you probably you've picked up already the differences in the stories, right? That the Hollywood stories tend to be much more individually centered, as Sam said, with the gangster rather than the gang. But if you just think about the ways in which films are shot between the two industries, right? First of all, 2 shots and 3 shots, meaning that the mise-en-scène will have 2 faces or 3 faces rather than 1 face. Much more common in Hong Kong than in Hollywood, which is very much focused on the star, right? Now why does that happen? Does it happen because of the story? Does it happen because of the different production where there's multi-camera setup? More common in Hong Kong than historically has been in Hollywood. But you can say that, certainly it's statistically documented, right, that the grammar of film style between the two industries is one that supports an individual versus one that supports the group.
As well as how the industry operates.
Yeah.
But there is something interesting about the brotherhood theme. So that's a very prevalent theme from Hong Kong film. But if you look at the hero genre, so the one which lasted with Ying Hong Sik until for 5 years, you see an evolution. The theme of brotherhood is there, and then it slowly dilutes. The place of the woman is completely out at the beginning, and then it's more and more integrated. And then it slowly moves to a love story, actually. Yeah, until it reached this the point of a moment of romance, the Chan Mok Sing, Sing Lin, Lau Tak Wah film, where it really transformed into no longer brotherhood. It's not the main aspect. It's the love for the girl, the heterosexual love, I would say.
So Anna, you mentioned about Wong Kar-wai, right? His film in France and sometimes shown in theater. So does that mean that there's some, fondness or love for his film among the French? And if so, why?
Yeah, for sure. There are a lot of people in France who love Wong Kar-wai. In The Mood for Love, actually, was a big hit. Why is it the case? Because French loves artistic films, and Wong Kar-wai is probably the most artistic director coming from Hong Kong. His visuals are very good, and there is probably a bit. I think he's quite a smart person, and he knows that his market is actually more outside Hong Kong, so he's kind of playing with the exoticism by having very good-looking actors and very cultural element which can please the West, basically. And it's very successful in this regard.
I think the Grandmaster was co-funded by French.
Co-funded, and the director of photography was French also. And Wong Kar-wai is used to work with foreigners. Christopher Doyle was his DP for a long time. Some French script writers actually worked uncredited in The Mood for Love. There were Julien Carbon and Laurent Courtiot, and they are actually people who worked on the Hong Kong HK Orient Extreme Cinema, the luxury magazine I talk about. They were also scriptwriters for Tokei Fung, Running Out of Time, the Lau Tak Wah, what was the other actor? Lau Ching Wan, Lau Tak Wah film. So yeah, Wong Kar-wai, but Wong Kar-wai is an exception. He's really not representative, I think, of the classic Hong Kong filmmakers.
You mentioned just earlier a moment of romance, and I would like to ask all of you, how would you explain that the love stories in those Triad movies are so strong? I take for an example, I'm a big fan of Young and Dangerous, Gua Jai, and the chapter of Sister 13, Sapsamoy, when there's a scene of her on the highway, she drank a lot, and there's Hon Ban driving her, and it's a big, big romance scene. How would you explain how the intensity, where that comes from?
That's a tough question. Well, but there is one thing which Hong Kong has always mastered. It's the mixing of genre. So they are very good at putting comedy, putting action, putting romance, putting everything so that everybody will find something they like. So I think it's part of that. Now, why is it so intense? I'm not sure myself, actually. Do you have an idea?
Well, I think one of them is love is wonderful. Romance is wonderful. So, I mean, telling love stories are wonderful. And I think, like Arnaud said, Hong Kong filmmakers are so good in blending genres. And I think Hong Kong filmmakers are always finding ways to blend genres. And I think with Wong Kar-wai, for example, we talk about Wong Kar-wai, his first film, As Tears Go By, Wong Gok Ka-mun. And another instance of Chinese title and English title has nothing to do with each other. But Wong Gok Ka-mun has it's actually a love story set in a gangster's background.
This film is especially interesting because it shows what I was trying to illustrate. You have basically two different stories. You have a hero story, the relation between Lau Ta-kwa and Chung Ok-hyo, which is completely hero, completely John Woo style. And at the same time, you have a love story, which is between Lau Ta-kwa and Chung Man-yuk. So it's this kind of evolution which the genre was completely in the middle of. And I'm sure you know about it, but actually Tang Kok-wing, who was the producer of the film, was not really satisfied by what Wong Kar-wai did. I guess he expected a more classical Triad film.
Well, I mean, I agree with what both the gentlemen are saying. I mean, the other thing also is always to think about sort of like what industrial change, like things happen because the industry changes, things happen because the artists change. And already Arnaud has talked about sort of like the 5-year cycle of the Inhong Bunsik films, the Inhong Pian, and then then much later towards the early 90s, you get the Guokjai. And one of the reasons why that people sort of account for that, the rise of the sort of replacement of the star-centered story by the ensemble cast of younger stars is it just became that one genre became exhausted, and then the industry has to search around for other things, right? And so, you know, I'm forgetting the Wong Kar-wai film. You know, as Tears Go By, right? You see that transition, right, happening. And then, of course, as Sam was saying, of course, you know, Hollywood has taught us, right, that the romance subplot is always a way to provide closure at the end, to provide satisfaction for all audience members.
No more?
So can you compare how the police is portrayed in Hong Kong movies and how, like, for example, FBI is portrayed in Hollywood, and how that is there any difference, and is there any culture related to that?
Yeah, this is probably my question. Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, it's very interesting, of course, in Hollywood, right? There have been historic collaborations or intersections between official surveillance and the industry, most obviously with Dragnet, where Jack Webb was a former officer and started transitioning to writing stories and sort of invents the genre of the procedural, right? The Dragnet, like just the facts, ma'am kind of narrative. Now, but that's a one-off sort of case in Hollywood, right? And in many cases, what you get in Hollywood films over and over again is this kind of othering of the establishment, right? The whole gangster tradition in the Hollywood tradition is very American, right? The quintessential American representative of surveillance is the private detective, right? The one who's in operations for himself frequently has to go against the law in order to make things right, right? Now, the case in Hong Kong is very interesting. All of you know, right, that the Hong Kong police, for many decades, right, had a very contested relationship with the local population because it was a colonial force. Right, it's put in here by the colonial government. It's literally, trained on the British system, right? So for, all the way through the early 60s, it is a very negative institution in Hong Kong. Allegations of rampant corruption, right? The Triads exist as a sort of protection scheme to protect local neighborhoods, right? And Triads are actually sort of seen as like the natural form of order within the Chinese community as opposed to the colonial police. And then, as you know, with the riots, right, there's sudden shift in public feeling that happens with the police. And so what I talk about in my book, starting in the late 60s going through the 70s, is this total synergy between a transforming Hong Kong police and a rising local media, right, where you have Chang Che actually making the film Police Force, amongst other things, Philip Chan, right, transitioning from the Hong Kong from RHKP to screenwriting films like Long Arm of the Law, right, and then so from starting in the 70s and the 80s, first of all, you get these like highly realistic procedurals like Long Arm of the Law. Well, that's in the 80s. Anti-corruption, Jumping Ash, which Philip Chan was involved with, right, trying to burnish and transform the reputation of the Hong Kong police, right, which is working hand in hand at the same time with actual reform policies within the police themselves. And so you get, remarkably, by the 1980s, the Hong Kong police are really seen, not just locally, but globally, as one of the world's most successful forces, which, by the way, is also one of the most, how do you define it? One of the most intensely policed urban environments in the world. So you have the largest number of police per capita, one of the largest number of police per capita of any city in the world. The police in Hong Kong have historically always had extraordinary powers of arrest and of custody, right? That much more so in many other in Western states for various reasons, right? And yet, by the late 70s throughout the 80s, especially going into the 1990s, when the police are sort of seen as the only official representative of Hong Kong, right? When after Tiananmen, the big question is who's going to police Hong Kong, right? So you have this sort of like Jackie Chan, like really sort of like, a heroic, like, man of the people that you get in movies like Police Story and the 50 other police movies that Jackie Chan has made. Like, on some level, they seem like purely commercial films, purely formulaic, generic films. And yet, at the same time, right, they're symptomatic of a very conscious collaboration between the official surveillance institution and the local media institution. So much so that, the song for Police Report, on TV and on the radio, right? That's Jackie Chan's song from Police Story, right? So constantly reminding you all the time of this collaboration. And of course, I don't need to tell all of you, like, the cinematic representation, the popular image of the police may not be the same anymore, but, that this kind of what seems like a purely generic formulaic representation in Hong Kong cinema actually has this very deep and fascinating history.